Moi, je vais lire ici, mais la présentation, oui,
Il faut attendre. Parce qu'on est, ça c'est rare, mais on est à l'avance. C'est bien, c'est mieux. C'est mieux qu'être en retard. Alors, tu veux dire parce que normalement, tu aurais. Ah non, il y a beaucoup de temps parce que ici. Ah non, je suis en train de voir. Oui, ici. Et alors, on a une heure, ça veut dire combien de temps tu vas 15 minutes. 20 minutes. D'accord, 20 minutes. Et alors, on fait des questions, et après c'est moi, 20 minutes. À peu près, moi, je pense 20 minutes.
C'est que pour vous,
vert. Après, si elle reste là, je ne vais pas partir. Elle est là, tu sais, on a l'invité pour qu'elle puisse participer à quelque chose. Et elle a pas pu venir, parce qu'elle n'a pas vu ça. Et après, on les laisse lui, mais il n'a pas pu la
Jag bara, hur tar jag bort den? Nu är den borta. Så jag står så här där och bara ser mig. Jag får bort den. Det var inget som hade sagt det. Jag bara... Det var jag. Ja, okej. Jag tror att det var...
Okay, I think we have to retake the session. So we are a little bit in advance, but we don't want to be late because several things are happening afterwards. And we have to keep the time. And this time, I'm not going to make the same mistake. I'm going to start by introducing our guest speaker. And this is Zahra Ouardi. And Zahra is one of the first founders of l'Union de l'Action Féminine, UAF, c'est an NGO, that's an NGO working in Morocco that is represented in about 10 cities, and they are focusing the fighting to end discrimination and marginalization of women. She is specialized in preparation of reports on violence against women and their socioeconomic status. And she has participated in several international conferences on human rights in Geneva and the sessions of the Commission on the Status of Women in the United Nations and New York, as well as in other women's stakeholders convenings in the MENA region, that means the region of North Africa, and in Europe. So welcome, Zahra, and she's going to make her presentation in English, but afterwards, when you ask, I'm going to help you, to help her to translate from French to English, okay? So.
Thank you, Edme. In beginning, I am sorry for my English. I speak a little English. The first time I present a conference in English. I speak Arabic or French.
Welcome.
Okay.
The danger and effects of violence, gender-based violence, prevent women from enjoying their rights and freedoms. Violence is discrimination against women and an expression of unequal relations between men and women. Violence violates women's human rights in the political, economic, social, and cultural spheres, fighting it from the main entry point to build a society of equality, democracy, and human rights. The responsibility of women's movements in combating violence. Combating gender-based violence is a priority for our work at UI. To break the silence on this subject, free the voice of battered women, and warn public opinion about its danger, and push the government to take decisions and policies to combat this phenomenon throughout pressure, suggestions, and advocacy. We have established a network of refuge centers in 40 cities to provide assistance and support to women victims of violence and to complete study and report. Union Women's Action and Najda SOS Centers experience. Najda SOS Centers provide annual report on violence against women and their types: physical, psychological, sexual, or economic. Characteristics and social status of victim, the characteristics of violence people and their relationship to their victim, the type of service provided to victim, legal, psychological, and social support, and parallel programs aimed at assisting these women. Figures reveal the seriousness of the phenomenon and its negative impact on them and their family. Society is its cost. Lack the protection and guarantee mechanism provided by the government. The role of the government: further implement this commitment for more than 2 decades. Morocco has committed to serious participation in the international human rights system by acceding to and ratifying the Convention of CEDAW, the Universal Declaration Against Violence Against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and lifting many reservations to the Convention related to the women's rights. The compatibility of Moroccan laws with them, family code, nationality law, labor law, and some measures to improve the representatives of women in elected council and position of responsibility, equality and anti-discrimination commission, law on combating human trafficking, combating victim violence in courts, police station and hospitals. The Constitution provides for all these rights. This is thanks to the pressure of the feminist and human rights movements. Anti-violence law 3103. This law was weak. It does not meet international standards, governed by conservative perspective. The principle of protection, guarantee, prevention, and impunity is not invoked as required. It did not adopt a participatory approach. It did not include a preamble showing its reference. It does not cover all types of violence, such as marital rape. They distinguish between women according to their family statute. Increased violence. 62 of women aged between 18 and 64 have suffered from violence in Morocco. Impunity for perpetrators because the traditional conservative mentality, the tolerance, violence, and justify its behavior. The stereotype image, which is based in the media, devoted to the inferiority of women. Only 83% of cases of marital violence brought before the courts, and only 3.1% for those detained. Victims who have previously filed complaints have not been taken seriously, either did not follow any action or arrest of the perpetrators and released to return to the tree or to carry out the crime. Suggestions and recommendations. Government responsibility to ensure survivor and impunity for the perpetrators, and program to prevent it by adopting the school and the media and various social media. Parliament is responsible for drafting laws to eliminate violence, formulating OBG and monitoring the government's work. The judiciary is responsible for the fair trial of victims and those accused of facilitating their access to justice and free of charge. Assist victims to provide and protect their violence before, during, and after sentencing. Municipalities are responsible for providing reception center, sheltering survivors, survivor and supporting association that fight violence. Parties, trade union, association, the private sector, and professional organization are responsible for spreading awareness among their constituents, promoting culture of human rights, non-discrimination, the sex in position of responsibility, and protecting women and girls from sexual harassment and violence in their organization field of work. Difficulty in accessing justice for women. Survivors suffer from the burden of rulers. They are obliged to file a complaint, make arguments, prepare a medical file, and enable the prosecution to provide information about the perpetrator or checking roles and their comprehensiveness, je m'excuse, from flying a complaint or initiating public action by the prosecution until the assurance and execution of the judgment. Establish specialized courts in cases of violence against women and deal with these cases quickly and effectively. To make the public prosecution responsible for cases of violence against women, because the victim is often pressured to give up her complaint or be ignorant of the procedure that enable her to access justice. Ensure coordination between health sector and civil society working in this field. Providing specialists in psychosocial assistance to accompany the victim and her children to obtain medical evidence and receive the necessary treatments. Sponsorship, la prise en charge, c'est la prise en charge. Providing shelter, even temporarily, provide adequate reception, guidance, and legal advice center. Providing specialized center to deal with crises resulting from the rape and all sexual assault, and various health services such as pregnancy testing and the possibility of sexual transmitted diseases. Direct employer to take into account the situation of working women victims in terms of not being fared because of their absence due to violence. Allocated a budget for urgent support for survivors to meet their urgent needs, rehabilitate and reintegrate them, and strengthen their capacity. Strategy and action plan. Training of law enforcement officials and those responsible for public policy. Conducting study, research, and completing statistics on violence against women, and evaluation the effectiveness of laws and measures implemented. Completion of an annual report on violence against women, its causes, and nurture the effectiveness and efficiency of strategy and the enforcement of laws to evaluate and develop legislation, sensibilization and training to combat stereotypes and promote gender discrimination in school, curricula, textbooks, and the media, promote a culture of equality, and combat all forms of discrimination based on gender, inclusion of human rights and equality, and combating gender-based violence.
Sorry. Like that. Sorry.
Inclusion of human rights and equality, and combating gender-based violence in teacher training institutes, at the standard of equality in the network of authoring for textbook writing. Training professional and intervention to combat violence. Compulsory training and continuous training on the rights of women and the principle of equality and the fight against violence for all law. Enforcement personnel, including police, gendarmes, judges, lawyers, doctors, nurses, and social assistants. Financial support for women victims of violence to cope with the consequence of violence. Re-education of victims of violence so as not to repair their criminal practice. Thank you, and excuse me for my language.
Thank you, Zahra. And I think that it's better if I go to my own presentation and then we can put together the questions for both of us. So I will do that now.
Edme.
Yes.
Får jag bara göra mig själv så att
Okay.
You can stay. Edme.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And now I'm going to make some kind of overview of what is happening regarding to these advances and backlashes of gender in other parts, far away from North Africa and far away from Europe, and that's Latin America. So I will focus on 3 cases, the case of Bolivia, Mexico, and Brazil. And I will try to do what I can do to have this overview very briefly, but of course, you know, it's always a challenge to say all what has to do in such short time. But anyway, these are the contents of what I'm going to speak about. What are the advances in Latin America since the 90s? And regarding that from above and from below, at the political, economic, and human rights level, legislations in gender-based violence as well. The advances in political representation, the case of Mexico and Bolivia, and the setbacks regarding political violence in these two cases, Mexico and Bolivia. The case of Brazil, of a very strong movement and a very weak legislation that had some advances, but that has gone back. And then a general reflection on the balance on backlash and what are the forces behind it. So first I wanted to introduce this by introducing the women's movement in Latin America. And I think this is a very, very unique movement because in Latin America, we have the tradition of gathering together lots of movements from all countries. And I don't speak only of NGOs, I speak of real movements, trade union movements, indigenous movements regarding women and feminist issues since the 80s. In 82, we started with the encuentros, which are the meetings of all these like feminist and women's forums that started in 82 in Colombia and that have been happening every 3 years in different countries of Latin America. These encuentros are gatherings. That's the translation of encuentro. And these are informal gatherings in the sense that are not really conferences. These are forums, you know, copying to what later will be the global forums, but these are mostly focusing on women and feminist issues. And these encuentros have been extremely important to shape the movements in Latin America, of all the countries in Latin America. And then they have gone on up to today. The latest one was in 2017 in Montevideo, Uruguay, but we had another one which I think was even bigger, and that was in Lima, Peru in 2014. From these encuentros, we have a broad list of issues that have been discussed at these encuentros. And you can see the shaping of the different parts of the movement being, you could say, much more consolidated through all these years in every country. So you have the movement of indigenous women, you have working class women, you have minors women, you have LGBT women, trans women, and you have all kinds of sectors consolidated within these encuentros. And one of the issues that has predominated and has gathered all of them is violence, the struggle against violence. So from these encuentros, we see the rise of what we call Ni Una Menos, the Ni Una Menos campaign, which is not more, no longer one more. And that is the campaign against sexual-based violence in all its forms that grew enormously in the last 10 years in the whole continent of Latin America, but you perhaps have heard much of it during the mobilizations in Argentina and in Brazil, as we shall see. From there are some researchers that have put together the concept of the feminist people, because these mobilizations have been huge. It's an enormous mass of people, and then all this concept has been grown up. And then we have the counteroffensive, the backlash, because of the Catholic and Christian churches. It's not only Catholic, it's also all the Protestant churches against these gatherings, and especially against all issues that have to do with gender demands. And at the background of this mobilization of churches and other groups, you have very strong patriarchal structures, mentalities, and what we call in Latin America toxic masculinities. So we start with Mexico, and here we have the record of political representation. The biggest record was Bolivia, and now it's Mexico. From the elections in 2018, the presidential and parliamentarian elections, we had that 49% in the lower chamber and 51% in the upper chamber are women, which is enormous, but only 14% among the majors at the municipal level. And that's a phenomenon that runs all over Latin America. You have an increase in women representation at several levels, even at the councils at the municipal level, but not regarding the executive level, which is always still in the hands of men. We have advances like the legalization of abortion in Mexico City, not in the whole country, only in Mexico City due to a government to the left and to certain circumstances since 2007. However, this legalization brought forward a lot of other obstacles regarding the decriminalization of abortion in the rest of the country. Because when this happened, then the church said, now we are going to resist to these kind of changes. So they start shaping new kind of legislations that were extremely, extremely rigorous to what was criminalized as abortion. And precisely as I mentioned before regarding El Salvador, lots of this happened in all the different states that are part of Mexico as a country. So in most of these states, legislation went backwards, saying that life conception was the limit. And so they started criminalizing abortion and putting a lot of women in jail because they had committed abortion or they had lost their children. So there are still lots of obstacles regarding gender issues in spite of these increased representation. Because in this case, many women represent their own parties and they give priority to political representation, to political loyalty to their parties than to women's issues. So gender-based violence, it has increased a lot as well, in spite of all kinds of legislation trying to criminalize it. And gender, in what you call murders, which these homicides, these femicides have increased as well. You know, Mexico is going through a whole wave of violence in general regarding criminality, but this is hitting particularly women in general. And so we see, for example, that in August, September this year, there were lots of marches, mobilizations of women tired of gender-based violence and feminicides. So we have a lot of mobilizations. These are women being represented, and these are women demonstrations, for example, in Mexico City during the summer and the autumn. Enormous mobilizations, and some of them have become violent. And as you see in one of these, they say, si violan mujeres, violamos sus leyes. If you rape women, we violate the laws. So, because they say, if we don't become violent, nobody's going to pay attention to us. The demonstrations come and go, and nobody does anything. So they start becoming violent, these demonstrations. Are these some of the people there? So now I go to the situation in Bolivia. You know, Bolivia nowadays is very much in the news, where you have also substantial advances, but also structural resistance. 2040, 53% of the lower house and 44% in the upper house were women in the parliament. At the municipal level, 51% of all municipal councillors were women. But as in the case of Mexico, only 8.5% of all mayors at the municipal level were women. But there is a problem, and I have done research on that. I have an article on that, political rotation. That means that many of these municipal councillors are elected for the period of 5 years. But in their communities, most of these women, especially when it's indigenous communities, but also it happens in the urban dwellings, these women, after 2 years, are forced to resign and leave their position to a man who comes as their deputy. This is not legal, but this is enforced informally in many, many municipalities. These women are harassed, threatened, and forced to resign because you could say the communities are following the rules of these quotas. Women must be there, but then after 2 years, they have to leave their post and they have to leave, and a man come and replace them. So this has created a law of political violence, and it was so much that it led to the law 2043 approved in 2012 after the murder of one of these women counselors that was struggling against this violence. In Bolivia, you have an NGO which is called ACOBOL that has extremely supporting this resistance of municipal women, municipal elected women. And this group has been very active, training these women to demand their rights and to have the capacity to be in these municipal councils. So what we see in Bolivia is an increase of the scripting representation. That means they are represented in all levels of society, but they still have no equal access to decision making. And that I call some kind of backlash. Here you see some of my pictures interviewing some of these women, municipal councillors in one of the cities, the small cities, which I was making my field work in. And ACOBOL and all the booklets they give out to try to help these women to struggle against this political harassment and to also give capacity training to these women. Then we go to Brazil, where you have a lot of advances and also serious backlashes. In Brazil, we don't have the same advances regarding political representation of women. As a matter of fact, Brazil is one of the countries that has less women at all levels, the national and the municipal and also the state level, because quotas have not been successful. There are many studies trying to explain why. Because of the kind of electoral system, because the resistance of these women, because the cost of getting into political campaigns, because of the structural patriarchal structures. Well, we have a lot of explanations to this. But the fact is that you have at the same time the contradictory phenomenon that you have women as presidents, and we have Dilma Rousseff, who was a president for some times and was also forced to resign afterwards, and who was extremely attacked, especially in the last period when she was losing this political power and when they forced her to resign. She was extremely attacked from what we call political gender-based harassment. Very questioned, and this the campaigns to make her resign were extremely gender campaigns, I could say, very misogyn campaigns. And the Bolsonaro campaign, the present president in Brazil, Bolsonaro, you could say, based his political campaign very much on his attacks against what he called, and many people call in Brazil, gender ideology, and not only in Brazil, but in the rest of Latin America. And the churches, military, upper middle class joined forces against the PT, the party of the workers that was sustaining Dilma Rousseff and before Lula, but also against the tolerance to sexual diversity and women and social rights in general. Counterattacking the PT, saying human rights are only for the right people. You see? So that was part of the campaign of Bolsonaro. And you see, the coup against Dilma Rousseff was extremely misogynist, aggressive, focusing very much on the fact that she was a woman and that she was incapable of political force and political executive force. So these were extremely aggressive attacks against the gender ideology, but also against Dilma as a woman. And these attacks against gender ideology, for example, they were a very conservative reaction promoted by sectors of the Catholic and evangelical churches against all kinds of advances on the rights of women and LGBTQ groups with reproductive rights. For example, the case of the gay kid, which Bolsonaro is showing there, is the fact that during the time of Dilma, there was a campaign to try to introduce into schools tolerance for sexual diversity, tolerance regarding homosexuality. And that was through the printing of special books for children, trying to normalize their attitude towards homosexuality. During the time of Dilma, this was permitted, the printing of these booklets, but they were never distributed. Why? Because there was the fear of this counter campaign if they were distributed in schools. So they were just kept there, they were never distributed. But then Bolsonaro started his political campaign saying, look what PT is doing. He's trying to turn all our children to become homosexuals. And they are doing that through the printing of this kind of propaganda, showing this booklet saying, this is how they are subverting our children. The booklet, as I said before, was never distributed, but he says it was distributed and it was really poisoning the mentalities of our children. So it was one of his main arguments in his campaign. Another strategy, fake news. They were trying to appeal families to repeal these new brochures and especially gender ideology ideas. They were trying to persecute teachers, trying to change mentalities, teachers who are trying to change mentalities, and they were distributing fake news. And one of these is this example of fake news. They were distributing these kind of baby bottles with this kind of, you know how you call it? Yes, yes, but in the form of a penis. And they created this, which, I mean, this never existed, but they created this and distributed through, you know, social media to say, look what they are doing. They are subverting, especially our babies. So this is a very good example of fake news, trying to manipulate, and many people believe that. Believe this was one of the campaigns of the PT, to try to distribute this erotic kind of baby things, just to change children's mentality and all could become homosexuals. Other campaign, one of a teacher, a professor at the university, given gender courses. One of her students accused her of intoxicating the students with the gender ideology, manipulating the students and trying to convert the students, brainwashing the students to become feminists. This is the student that questioned her, sent her to trial, and she was put into trial, this teacher, this professor, and of course she was found completely innocent. And the student became one of the main supporters of Bolsonaro in the Bolsonaro political campaign. And he was very much in favor of using arms, as you see here. And she wrote a book called Feminismo Perversao or Subversao, trying to say feminism is a kind of perversion and subversion. And as you see the image here, it's the head of Saint Jean Baptiste. This is what feminists want, to cut the head of all men. You see? So this was just part as a campaign of Bolsonaro against the gender ideology. Another issue, the campaign against Judith Butler. Many of you know who's Judith Butler, one of the main, you could say, theoreticians, thinkers within feminist thought. Well, she visited Brazil. That was before the campaign of Bolsonaro. And many of these conservative forces organized demonstrations against Judith Butler, saying that she was a witch that was trying to brainwash all women. And they organized these marches that you see here, and they built an image of her and then burned it in front of the place where she was going to speak. So this is part of the campaign. That was before the political campaign of Bolsonaro, but just that you see the whole frame.
Which year was this?
This was, let me see, it was 2017. And finally, the execution of Miguel Franco, who was a municipal councillor at Rio de Janeiro, a very well-known leader of the favelas, the poor neighborhoods in Rio, a very well-known figure fighting against machismo, against racism, and for poor families, because she was lesbian and Black and politically engaged. Already being a municipal councillor, she was killed together with her driver in the middle of Rio de Janeiro in March 2018. And they still don't know who were behind this murder. I mean, they have captured some people that are thought to be the executors, but there are rumors that behind the whole murder was Bolsonaro himself and his family against Miguel Franco, who had become an enormous popular leader in Brazil. But in spite of all these backlashes and offensive, as I said, with all these forces that I have named before, you have an enormous feminist movement in Brazil. One of the strongest movements in the whole continent. So during many years, they have been demonstrated, and they have increased this demonstration in the last years. They have created a lot of campaigns of resistance. For example, one of them was Ele Now, that was during the campaign of Bolsonaro, saying not him, and on the 8th of March. And you see in these images, part of these demonstrations, the symbols of the support of Marielle, who was executed, and the strike of women during the 8th of March. So there are also Black Women's March, because it's an enormous multi-phase movement, you could say. You have indigenous women, you have Black women, etc. So this was, the marches have been there since, as I said, many years before. And this is one of the enormous marches against Bolsonaro. Finally, one part of this counteroffensive from the feminist movement has been the organization of conferences. And this is going to take place 2020, next year, but there was a first Facendo Género, making gender, that took place 2 years ago. So final reflections. I think the backlashes are part of this kind of physical law of advances and setbacks, backlashes. So you advance 3 steps, and then you have to go back perhaps 1 because of these reactions that you create advancing. This is an extreme struggle against power structures, against mentalities, and the certainty of the traditional that can vary but is there and is used very strongly, and the uncertainty of the unknown. What's going to happen if all these women get right, you know, all this is going to change. It's a dirty war. You have seen it in the kind of fake news and all these kind of extreme campaigns and creating myths, completely false myths. But the resistance is still extremely strong. And we shall see how it's going to decide the balance of this situation. Thank you. Okay, I think we have some time. Yes, for questions. I leave some minutes for questions. So both to Zahra and me. Yes, Lisa.
I have a question for you, Zahra. The sponsorships that you get to do in order to do your work, where do they come from, and how are you able to do all this work?
Oui, oui. La prise en charge. La prise en charge, mais surtout si vous avez des ressources pour faire tout ce que vous voulez.
Non,
que les groupes.
Je parle de la responsabilité de l'État, du gouvernement.
Oui, 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 mais elle demande si, comme société civile, vous avez des ressources.
Non, c'est des ministères qui nous aident, donnent une subvention de chaque année.
And she says that they don't have much resources and they are depending on some money given by the Minister of Social Affairs. Yes.
Was there a Me Too movement in Morocco?
Est-ce qu'il y a eu une campagne Me Too?
Oui, il y a un mouvement féministe très fort. Il travaille toujours, il manifeste, il insiste pour changer les lois. C'est nous
mais la campagne Me Too pour dénoncer tous les tracasseries, ça existe.
Oui, on a aussi une campagne maintenant pour les droits humains. La femme a le droit sur son corps, a le droit de l'avortement. Il y a aussi
yes, there has been some movement around this, and you have also a very strong feminist movement trying to fight against all this kind of harassment.
How was it in Brazil?
Me Too, I don't think that Me Too has had such a repercussion as this moment, as Me Too movement, because there is still, there's already a struggle for women's rights. So I don't think it has so much effect as the Me Too movement. It had effects, I mean, the whole issue of increasing violence has been the main issue, not so much the Me Too movement.
I also have a question for Zahra. The UAF has very ambitious aims in terms of the measures to be taken by the municipalities, by the government, by the private sector, which is wonderful, of course. So I was just wondering, what capacities does the UAF have to pursue these? How many members do they have?
Que vous avez beaucoup de buts et des ambitions, mais quelles capacités vous avez, combien de membres vous avez, quel type de ressources?
Nous sommes une association nationale.
We are a national association.
Beaucoup de centres pour accueillir des femmes.
That has a lot of centers, a network of centers to take care of women.
Nous avons aussi, c'est le premier centre d'accueil, c'était notre centre à Rabat.
The first center was the one founded in Rabat.
Mais nous ne sommes pas seuls. Il y a beaucoup d'associations très fortes qui font le même. Il y a tout un mouvement féministe qui travaille pour ce sujet.
They are not alone because they have a lot of other associations that are working for the same goals all over Morocco. Other questions? Yes?
Yes. Is there any explanation or any idea why women, when it comes to voting, vote for people like Bolsonaro or for other right-wing conservative men? That is a question that
Yes, il y a des explications pourquoi certaines femmes votent encore pour l'extrême droite, pour la droite en général.
J'ai pas bien compris.
Pourquoi est-ce qu'il y a des femmes qui, malgré tout, votent pour la droite, pour les gouvernements conservateurs?
Je n'ai pas encore compris.
Pourquoi est-ce qu'il y a des femmes qui votent pour des gouvernements conservateurs?
Oui. Je veux dire que nous vivons dans le même monde et dans le même temps. Nous avons les mêmes problèmes comme femmes. Mais chaque gouvernement fait des politiques. Notre gouvernement il a une référence islamiste, religion. C'est pourquoi ils sont les premiers de deux fois, parce que la démocratie demande beaucoup et on a presque 50% des femmes analphabètes. La plupart des femmes sont pauvres, ils n'ont pas de capacité pour vivre.
You have understood more or less that there is a very big diversity among women, and given the fact that it's a democracy, also many groups take advantage of the ignorance. And in the case of Morocco, you have a lot of women who cannot write, who cannot read and write, and so they are easily manipulated by religious groups. And that is the reason that they can vote whatever to the right. In the case of Brazil, in the case of other countries, I think it's a question of social classes. If you have groups very well in a very good economic situation, and especially in societies like in Latin America where social inequality is so big. So you have many of these women from upper classes, very conservative, that see absolutely no reason why they would become feminists, because they have a lot of privileges and they don't think they have any need to struggle for anything else. So even though violence is still something that happens in these upper classes, but you have a lot of women who think very much to the right, keeping their privileges and keeping this kind of social differentiation.
Et aussi, je veux ajouter une chose, qu'il y a seulement 27% qui votent dans le Maroc.
De toute la population.
Le 73% ne votent pas.
In Morocco, you have only 27% of the population that votes.
Sorry?
27% of the population that votes.
The
rest don't vote.
But this is more like a global question. We have the same problem in Sweden. You don't have to look that far away. And it's just a question.
Yes.
And what can we do to change that? Why do women vote against their own interests?
I think that is a very big question that we can keep discussing during the conference. Pourquoi est-ce qu'il y a des femmes qui votent en contre des droits des femmes?
Oui, parce qu'il y a la religion.
And she says that one of the reasons is religion.
La religion qui croit que le monde est dominant.
The religion that wants to keep the same kind of hierarchies.
I understand that. It's the same problem in
everywhere.
All countries, everywhere. And you always can point to traditions, religion, or beliefs. We have also the Witness of Jehovah, the Mormons, and other people have the same problem in the West. But still, why do women vote against their own interests? Why do they allow it? We are a majority. And more women are born,
because they don't have the conscience.
Boys.
But I would say, I would say that there's a lack of consciousness that they have this kind of problems themselves.
This mentality the woman, the mother, give for their children.
Yes, so it's a mentality that is being permanented because of this kind of education that reproduces this kind of behavior.
Elle n'est pas égale à l'homme.
This kind of inequality and that makes it permanent.
À cause de l'éducation, à cause de la plupart des mentalités, et c'est en tout le monde arabe, ça a changé. Ça a changé. Avant, c'était le gauche qui domine dans la société. Mais après, c'est la même chose dans tout le monde arabe. Les gouverneurs sont faibles. Il y a des crises économiques. Et c'est pour ça que nous restons. Il y a une différence entre le Suède, la politique de gouvernement, c'est une grande différence entre notre politique. On a fait beaucoup d'efforts pour changer la loi, mais l'application, c'est la même mentalité qui applique cette loi. Elle refuse ce qu'il veut et il fait ce qu'il veut.
Yes, that there have been a lot of efforts to change the laws, but the mentalities are the same. And before you had governments to the left that made some changes, but now you have governments to the right, or very weak governments that do not make this a priority at all. But you had some, yes.
Well, I just wanted to add that I think that some of the reasons also have to do with what politicians themselves promise. Because if you, as a group, think that, in the case of the United States, for example, if you think that migration is the biggest issue and it's hindering you and your family a lot, then maybe you'll push gender issues a little bit to the side if this person promises, I don't know, to get rid of migrants. Or in case of corruption, for example, so it's like, no, we will be a military force or whatever, so it's like every time, then like push it. I think it's also one of the biggest reasons.
Oh, I understand. It's more like
very rational.
that it doesn't change. It's like if you piece of chocolate and a slap in the face, it's not chocolate I slapped you, it's okay. So,
Mentalité, c'est la même chose que tu as dit, qu'il y a une mentalité qui sont manipulées aussi. Other questions? Yes.
Could you say something about the situation of lone mothers? Because I have read about Moroccan lone mothers that is quite a very difficult situation for them. That their children are not allowed to carry the name of the father, for instance.
Des femmes célibataires qui n'ont pas de occupants, il n'y a pas de
On a des associations qui travaillent et la loi donne le droit à ces femmes d'avoir que leurs enfants avoir les noms et tous les droits.
There is a legislation now that forces or that permits these women to carry the name, to give the name of the father to the children. So that is now the situation. There was some question there.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about Morocco. If there are similarities to the campaigns that to the ways the far right uses, like gender and the family, and refers to gender ideology, for example, in electoral campaigns. If there are similarities in Morocco, like to this. How it was described
Ici, il y a des choses similaires en Amérique latine, mais qu'il y a des campagnes contre des genres. Est-ce qu'il y a des campagnes comme ça au Maroc?
Non, il y avait une campagne en 2000 le nom pour l'égalité, contre la violence, contre la pauvreté des femmes. Il y avait une manifestation contre cette manifestation.
Au Maroc, then the year 2000, there were a lot of forces and demonstrations for the equality of gender equality, but there were counter manifestations against that.
Il y avait un rabbin donné, mais il y avait une manifestation contre, c'est à Casablanca. Et
For example, there were
politique islamiste.
there were manifestations for example, in one city like Rabat, and then counter manifestations in other cities like Casablanca that were manipulated especially by Islamic groups. Yes. Other question?
Yeah, and can I just add? I wonder if they really use the same, like, gender ideology. They use the same kind of language.
The right, you mean?
Yeah, sexualization of children, the
Yes.
family being invaded. They use the same rhetoric.
Est-ce qu'il y a qui est utilisé par les ennemis féministes? Qu'il y a le même type de langage contre les genres, l'idéologie de genre. Non, que si ça existe.
Oui, souvent il y a des contre-attaques, par exemple.
Mais en utilisant ce type de vocabulaire contre l'idéologie des genres.
Il y a des attaques, il y a même des pratiques. Ils veulent tuer des femmes qui sont contre, parce qu'on a demandé le droit d'avortement, le droit d'avoir une relation libre entre les femmes et les hommes, et le droit de religion, si je veux.
Oui, yes, it is.
Beaucoup de problèmes.
Yes, it is used. These attacks, especially from the right, they are used, and even women have been attacked physically because they are militants regarding the trying to get more rights, and they have been attacked and harassed and threatened. So yes, this has been part of the campaigns. There was a question there.
Ja, det var två frågor, jag ska se på svenska. Mexiko, som jobbar med den kvinnoorganisationerna, liknande arbetar ni samarbetar med andra europeiska finska kvinnoorganisationer eller inte? Andra fråga.
I Mexiko menar du?
I Mexiko, när det var Brasilien som ni jobbar med kvinnoorganisationer som presenterar som har.
Aha. Ja, om det finns ett samarbete med andra organisationer utomlands, eller? Utomlands, utanför Mexiko?
Ja.
Aha, okej.
Och plus på varför finns mycket kvinnotryck genom regionen eller liknande som påverkar kvinnorna att motsatsa, de använder mot varandra, röstar mot varandra.
I Mexiko?
Nej, jag vet inte.
Men det var samma fråga som här, att varför när det gäller Mexiko, ja visst, finns samarbete. Sorry. In Mexico, yes, there are lots of networks, international networks. So many NGOs have their networks regarding the kind of work they do against gender violence, for economic rights, whatever. And especially regarding violence, for example, there was an enormous campaign to stop feminicides in the north part of Mexico, when there was Ciudad Juárez in the border, Mexico, the US, that started to take place in the 90s. And there was an enormous campaign to stop these murders of women. That's where the word feminicide started. And especially supported by NGOs in the United States and Canada. And also involving other Latin American countries. And they also wanted to involve the European Union and some kind of pressure from the European Union to the Mexican government, but it didn't work. But yes, there is a lot of transnational solidarity regarding all kinds of work for these organizations. And the second question was the same that was put here: why do women vote against women, or why do there is no solidarity? And I think, as I said before, it's a complex situation. It has to do with religion, it has to do with class, it has to do with nationalism, but not so much nationalist. I would say mostly the socioeconomic situation of the women.
It's feminationalism.
Yes, perhaps yes, with migrants, yes, regarding migrants. But in the case of Latin America, it's not so much that, it's mostly socioeconomic issues. And that, I think, are the main reason for this kind of voting against women's rights. Yes, and now we have to stop because we have to go on with our program. We still have several speakers. Thank you very much. So now we start with,
we have 10 minutes.
in 10 minutes, no, 10 minutes, yes.
We have a break.
We have
10 minutes.
10 minutes to stretch.